In 2011, solo backpacker Evan Hart disappeared without a trace near the Colorado River. No body, no gear, no sign of struggle. For over a decade, the case was cold, until two fishermen gut a giant catfish and discover something that should have never been there. A weathered keychain with Evan's initials carved by hand. The morning Evan Hart disappeared, the desert was quiet. Wind moved like breath across the sandstone cliffs above the Colorado River, whispering through dry brush and casting shadows that shifted with every minute of the rising sun. Evan had been on the trail for 3 days. He'd set off from Page, Arizona with a loaded pack, a topographical map, and a promise to check in after his 4th night out. His plan was simple: hike down to the Horseshoe Bend overlook, follow a secluded route along the rim, and camp at a hidden cove a local guide had once told him about. It was ambitious for a solo trip, but Evan was no amateur. At 28, he'd already backpacked through the Pacific Northwest, the Sierra Nevadas, and parts of Alaska. He wasn't reckless, just drawn to solitude. The last known sighting of him came from a retired couple arving in the area. They saw him walking along the upper ledge near Horseshoe Bend around mid-morning, tall and sunburned, wearing a faded green windbreaker and a white baseball cap. The man said Evan waved as they passed. "Looked like he knew where he was going," the woman recalled later. "He never made it to the cove. He never checked in." By the evening of the 4th day, when Evan's mother hadn't received his scheduled call, she grew nervous. By the 6th day, she called the Coconino County Sheriff's Office. A search was launched within 24 hours. Helicopters scanned the river and cliffs. Kayakers from a nearby outfitter volunteered to patrol the winding banks. Drones were deployed where terrain made travel impossible. For days, the teams combed a 40-mile stretch from Glen Canyon Dam to Lee's Ferry. On the 8th day, a searcher spotted something tangled in a cluster of tamarisks near the waterline, a dark shape barely visible between the pale green brush. It was Evan's backpack. The straps were frayed. A small rip along the side pocket looked like it had been torn. Inside were a partially soggy topographic map, a granola bar still sealed in plastic, and a notebook filled with sketches and quotes in Evan's neat handwriting. One page read, "The river doesn't take, it keeps." The date was 2 days before he vanished. Near the pack, the searchers also found his sleeping bag. It was damp but intact. No blood, no footprints, no sign of a scuffle. It was as if he'd just stepped away. Investigators theorized a few things. Evan might have slipped on the loose rock and fallen into the river, pulled under by the weight of his pack. But the spot where the gear was found wasn't far from shore, and the bank was gentle, not sheer. Others wondered if he encountered someone on the trail, someone who wanted him gone. But the desert left no clues. His phone was missing. So was the keychain that had been clipped to his belt loop, a handmade wooden charm he'd carved as a teenager, shaped like a compass with his initials scratched into one side. His family had always considered it his lucky token. With no body, no conclusive evidence, and no witnesses, the search began to stall. But for his parents, each passing day without answers was a torment. They stayed in Page for weeks after the official search was scaled back, retracing Evan's likely route, passing out flyers to river guides and Navajo Nation locals, asking questions that no one could answer. His mother, Joan, clung to the belief he might still be alive, maybe concussed, maybe living off-grid somewhere, too afraid or confused to come back. His father, Daniel, quieter and more skeptical, began keeping a log of every false lead they received. "Just in case the pieces line up someday," he told the sheriff's office. But nothing lined up, not for weeks, not for months, not for years. Back in their home in Flagstaff, the Harts kept Evan's room untouched. His photos lined the mantel. Every Christmas, Joan wrapped a gift with his name and tucked it beneath the tree. Daniel mailed postcards to the P.O. box Evan used for his trail correspondence, even though they knew it sat empty. There were sightings, of course. There always are. A man matching Evan's description at a gas station in Utah. Another near Taos, mumbling to himself by the side of a road. Joan followed each tip. Sometimes she'd drive overnight to check in person, but they never panned out. Evan Hart became a name in a case file, a face on a fading poster, a question no one could answer, and the river, as always, kept its silence. The discovery of Evan's backpack should have narrowed the search, but in truth, it only deepened the uncertainty. The terrain near the Colorado River was both breathtaking and treacherous. Towering red cliffs gave way to sudden drop-offs, and the shoreline snaked through canyons that swallowed sound and sight in equal measure. The recovered gear had been lodged in brush just above the waterline, suggesting it hadn't simply drifted there. The bag was dry in places, suggesting it hadn't been fully submerged. There were no drag marks, no prints, just the sleeping bag, snagged on rocks, and the backpack sitting oddly upright, as if placed there. Sheriff's deputies brought in dogs to search the area around the site, hoping for a scent trail. But the heat and exposure had erased everything. Still, the handlers tried, and the dogs circled the area with growing frustration, whimpering when they reached the water. Divers were called in, but visibility was poor. The riverbed near Horseshoe Bend dropped off sharply, and the currents churned silt from the bottom, reducing sight to nothing within inches. They searched anyway, for 6 days. Nothing turned up. Then came the reports, half whispers, half rumor, from other backpackers in the region. One group of hikers claimed they had seen a man crouched near the waterline just before dusk the night Evan vanished. He was barefoot, one said, just standing there, no gear. We thought it was weird, but figured he was camping close. The location they pointed to was miles upstream from where the gear had been found. The timeline didn't quite match, but it was the only lead that placed a living Evan somewhere after the last verified sighting. Still, without photos or physical confirmation, it was little more than a hopeful story. The Hart family held on to it. Meanwhile, detectives started to run through possibilities, some procedural, others more desperate. Could Evan have suffered a psychotic break? Could he have staged a disappearance, like those rare but not unheard of cases where hikers slip off the grid to reinvent themselves? His journals didn't suggest any such intent. In fact, they were filled with plans, notes about trails he wanted to hike, sketches of a potential book cover, thoughts about teaching wilderness survival classes to teens. "I want to do something useful," one entry read. "It's not enough to just see things. You have to pass them on." An accident, then? Maybe. But if he had fallen into the river, where was the body? Bodies don't always surface in the Colorado, especially if they get caught in debris or trapped in underwater pockets. But that didn't explain the placement of the pack and sleeping bag. That felt curated. There was another possibility that investigators hated discussing but couldn't ignore. Foul play. Plenty of loners and drifters moved through the canyon country. The trails were remote and rarely patrolled. It wouldn't have been hard for someone to stumble upon Evan, especially if he'd camped near a known route. Perhaps he met someone out there, someone who didn't have good intentions. If there had been a confrontation, it could have ended without a trace, especially if it occurred near the water. But again, no signs, no struggle, no blood, just silence. And then the false leads started pouring in. A week after the search was scaled back, a call came in from a woman in Kayenta. She claimed her brother had seen Evan in town, dazed and barefoot. Deputies followed up, found the man she mentioned. He denied everything. A blurry gas station photo from Marble Canyon showed a man who could have been Evan, but the timestamp predated his departure by 2 days. A psychic even called the sheriff's office, offering a vision of Evan trapped beneath red stone and kept from peace by something mechanical. The report was filed, but dismissed. For the Hart family, these small flames of hope, each snuffed out in time, were the hardest part. Joan Hart became withdrawn. Daniel Hart became more methodical, almost obsessive. He created maps, tracking every sighting, every detail, creating strings of red thread on a corkboard at home that connected places, names, dates, and nothing solid in between. And time moved on. 2 years passed. Then 3. At 5 years, Evan was declared legally dead. Joan refused to attend the hearing. She said that as long as there was no body, there was no truth in the law's paperwork. The backpack and sleeping bag were boxed and returned to the Harts. Joan placed them in Evan's room. She would open the pack every so often, run her fingers over the soaked fabric, reread the notebook. It always struck her as strange. Why had the pages survived so well? Had it really been in the water long? Daniel focused on technical details, weather patterns, silt flow rates, current speeds, all in hopes of explaining why Evan's body had never turned up. But he never reached a satisfying answer. By year 7, the case had become a local mystery, a quiet ache that haunted Horseshoe Bend and the backcountry beyond it. New hikers would sometimes mention the Hart Boy when passing through the area. Park rangers kept a photo pinned in their outpost, just in case. But no one expected new evidence, especially not from a catfish. It was late spring when the fish was caught. 12 years to the month since Evan Hart disappeared. The Colorado River was high with snowmelt, muddy and loud as it swept through the canyons. Locals in the area around Horseshoe Bend knew better than to fish during runoff. But Bobby Kerr and his cousin Ray didn't care. They fished year-round. Both men had grown up in Page and knew the water as well as anyone could. That morning, they loaded up Bobby's rusted-out John boat and drifted a mile downriver from Lee's Ferry, casting lines into the deeper channels where the catfish hid during the heat. They weren't expecting anything big, not with the current moving like that. But 2 hours in, Bobby felt a tug like nothing he'd known. The rod bent until it nearly cracked. Ray grabbed a net. The fish surfaced only once, long enough for both men to gasp. "Jesus," Bobby muttered, "it's a hog." It took nearly 30 minutes to land the fish. When they finally got it in the boat, it flopped and thrashed with prehistoric strength. It was a blue catfish, old and bloated, its belly distended like it had swallowed a football. At 72 pounds, it would be the biggest cat either of them had ever caught. Bobby joked about mounting it. Ray just stared at its glassy, yellowed eye. They motored back upriver in silence. Bobby's grin didn't fade. That night, in Bobby's garage, they laid the fish on an old workbench and set up a tripod to film the cleaning process. They did this often for YouTube, a hobby-turned-side hustle for the cousins. Bobby cracked a beer. Ray sharpened the fillet knife. The gutting began as usual. Intestines, partially digested crawdads, river weeds. And then, "What the hell is that?" Ray said, pointing. Bobby leaned in. "That ain't bone." He reached in with gloved fingers and pulled it free. A small object, round on one side, squared on the other, encrusted with grit, slimy. He dropped it in the wash basin and sprayed it down. Slowly, the grime lifted. It was a wooden keychain. Oval, with a faint compass design carved into the face. The back had 2 initials, EH. Ray stared at it, then turned to Bobby. "Is that real?" Bobby didn't answer right away. He walked into the house, rummaged through a drawer, and came back holding a laminated flyer, a missing person poster, weathered from years of sitting under paperwork and old tax forms. Missing, Evan Hart, last seen May 2011, near Colorado River, Horseshoe Bend, age at time of disappearance, 28, distinguishing features, scar under left eye, compass keychain on belt loop. Bobby looked at Ray again. This was that kid, right? The one who vanished hiking? Ray's mouth hung open slightly. You kept the flyer? I don't know. My mom had it taped to the fridge forever. They stared at the keychain. It was impossible. 12 years, a catfish. And yet here it was, just as the poster described. The next morning, they brought the keychain to the sheriff's substation in Page. At first, the deputy on duty barely glanced at it. But once he heard the name Evan Hart, everything changed. Within an hour, 2 detectives were reviewing the footage from the gutting video. They watched Bobby lift the object from the catfish, heard Ray say, "Is that real?" and saw the camera focus on the carved initials. The item was bagged and sent to the state crime lab. Joan Hart got the call 2 days later. She answered on the second ring, expecting a telemarketer. Instead, she heard, "Mrs. Hart, this is Detective Rowan with the Coconino County Sheriff's Department. We've recovered something that may belong to your son." Her breath caught. She didn't speak. "Are you sitting down?" Rowan asked. It took her a full minute to respond. Is it him?" "Not yet," Rowan said gently. "But we've recovered a keychain. One that matches the description from your original report. It was found inside a catfish." The words sounded absurd. Her knees gave way. She slid to the floor. Daniel Hart flew back from a conference in Denver the next morning. Together, they drove to the substation, where the evidence tech laid the keychain on a white cloth. Joan didn't even need to pick it up. "That's his," she whispered. Daniel leaned closer. "He made that in 9th grade. His shop project. The keychain had aged. The varnish was nearly gone. But the faint compass design, the crude carving of EH, it was unmistakable." Joan held it for a long time, tears running silently down her cheeks. It was the first tangible connection to her son in over a decade. Lab results confirmed it. The wood grain matched photos of Evan's original project. The carving marks aligned with a whittling knife Evan had once owned. Traces of DNA were still present, likely preserved by the cool internal temperature of the catfish and the wood's relative protection from direct digestion. The odds were astronomical, but it was real, and now, the sheriff's department had no choice. The case was officially reopened. The keychain sparked something that hadn't stirred in years: institutional momentum. Evan Hart's disappearance, long relegated to the dusty archives of cold case files, was suddenly back in the active investigation pile. And more than that, it had public attention again. Within a week, local news outlets were running headlines. "Keychain in catfish may reopen. Mysterious river disappearance." National media followed shortly. Evan's face appeared on television screens across the country once more. Older now, digitally aged by analysts, but still him, still missing, still unfinished. Detective Rowan, who had inherited the cold file only a year prior, was both invigorated and overwhelmed. She had never expected much from the Hart case. She had read through it, like so many others, feeling that same sinking dread that comes from chasing phantoms. But now? Now there was something tangible, something weird. Yes, but real. Rowan assembled a task force of 3 investigators and brought in forensic hydrologist Dr. Maya Trenholm, who specialized in aquatic drift and deposition. If Evan's keychain had been found inside a catfish 12 years after his disappearance, there was only one question worth asking. Where had the fish been? Trenholm explained that while catfish were bottom dwellers and could travel, They were also highly territorial, especially older, larger ones. The fish that swallowed Evan's keychain had likely lived in the same few miles of river for most of its life. She circled a 15-mile stretch of the Colorado between Horseshoe Bend and the Marble Canyon Narrows. If this came out of that fish, she told them, Evan's remains, or whatever's left, are likely still in this zone. The river was no longer at its spring peak, which helped. Still, the currents were strong, and visibility remained a challenge. Rowan secured a team of divers with sonar, dredging equipment, and specialized underwater drones. The operation base was set at a bend in the river near where the Catfish had been caught. The Harts were informed of the search, but chose not to attend. Joan said she couldn't bear to watch the river again. Daniel stayed close to his wife. On the third day of scanning, a sonar technician flagged a strange anomaly beneath a shelf of submerged rock. The outline was unusual, too angular, too consistent to be natural. Divers were sent in. They descended carefully, lights flickering through murky water. The site was 28 feet down, tucked beneath a limestone overhang reinforced with silt and tangled branches. It wasn't a body, not yet, but it was a waterproof bag, sealed with clips and lodged behind a wedge of stone. Inside, after the slow and careful retrieval, investigators found a partially decomposed canvas notebook, a metal thermos, rusted and sealed, a folding knife, a single hiking boot, and a water-damaged, older model camcorder. The camera was the first thing they processed. After a few days of drying and treatment, technicians were able to extract a portion of the memory. The footage was grainy, water-damaged, but it worked. Evan's face filled the screen. He was seated against rock, dirt smudged across his forehead, speaking directly into the camera. "I don't know if anyone's going to find this," he said. "But if you do, I think someone followed me. I've seen the same figure for the last 2 nights. Thought I was imagining it, but this morning I found boot prints, not mine." He looked over his shoulder, then back to the lens. "If something happens to me, please tell my family I didn't mean to stay away. I was trying to make it home." The footage glitched, then cut to black. Rowan watched the video 3 times. Her hands trembled slightly. Then she called Joan and Daniel Hart. They arrived 2 days later, not for the press conference or the media frenzy, but to sit alone in the room where the camera was kept. They watched their son speak into that lens, and for the first time in 12 years, they heard his voice again. Not through memory, not in dreams, but real. Raw. Joan wept silently. Daniel kept whispering. He was scared. He knew. For investigators, the footage changed the narrative entirely. Theories of accidental drowning were now obsolete. This wasn't a man who slipped into the river by mistake. This was a man who feared for his life, who took the time to hide evidence, who saw someone, followed by someone. And if Evan saw footprints, that suggested proximity, an actual human threat. That sent investigators back to the original search files with fresh eyes. They reviewed all volunteer sign-ins, all ranger reports, all tip-line calls logged in those frantic early weeks. And then Rowan found something she hadn't expected. On May 17, 2011, 6 days after Evan was last seen, a man named Thomas Wilkes called the tip line. He claimed to have seen someone resembling Evan hiking upriver on the 3rd night of the disappearance. He left a callback number and a name, but no one had followed up at the time. There were dozens of tips like it. No coordinates, no urgency. Rowan ran the number. Disconnected. She ran the name. Thomas Wilkes had no prior criminal history, but there was one curious note in his DMV file. In 2010, he had legally changed his name from Derek Ames. Rowan froze. That name appeared again, buried in the volunteer logs. Derek Ames had signed in as a searcher on May 20, 2011, just 9 days after Evan went missing. Same man, 2 names, and no one had ever cross-referenced them. Rowan leaned back in her chair. chills crawling up her spine. She picked up the phone. It's time we had a conversation with Mr. Wilkes. Thomas Wilkes lived in a mobile home community just outside of Kayenta, Arizona. He kept to himself, according to neighbors, did some part-time welding for ranchers, occasionally hauled scrap metal in an old pickup, and didn't say much beyond morning or evening. He had no social media, no online footprint beyond vehicle registration, and a rarely used email address. His phone had been disconnected months prior. Detective Rowan drove out with Deputy Rios, a Navajo officer familiar with the area. They knocked on the door mid-morning under the pretext of a follow-up on a long-closed missing persons case. The structure was small, barely held together by siding and patched aluminum, but someone moved behind the curtain. They waited. The door opened. Wilkes, if that was still the right name, stood in the frame, thin and wiry, face shaded by a weathered baseball cap. His gray beard was short, his eyes distant. "You Thomas Wilkes?" Rowan asked. "That's me." She introduced herself, showed him a badge. "We're reopening a missing persons case. 2011. Evan Hart. You called in a tip back then. Mind if we talk?" He stared at her, then nodded slowly. They entered the trailer. It was cleaner than expected, cluttered but not chaotic. An open Bible rested on a crate near the couch. Rowan took a seat, pulled out a notepad. "You said you saw a hiker back in 2011, resembled Evan Hart. Can you tell me more about that?" Wilkes scratched his chin. "It was dusk. I was near the canyon bend, scoping spots for fishing. I saw someone moving along the ridge. Thought maybe he needed help. But by the time I crossed the bend, he was gone." "Did you approach?" "No, I was across the river." "You never got closer?" He shook his head. "Didn't see him again." Rowan nodded slowly. "You also signed up as a volunteer in the search party, but you used the name Derek Ames." Wilkes flinched, just slightly. She let the silence sit. "I changed my name in 2010. Didn't think it mattered for the search." "Why the name change?" "Long story. Bad marriage. Wanted to disappear for a while." Rowan didn't buy it. Not entirely. But there was no immediate proof of wrongdoing. Not yet. "Mind if we look around?" His eyes narrowed. "You got a warrant?" "Not yet," Rowan said, "but I can get one." He considered her a moment, then stood up and walked to the door. "Then get one." He closed it behind them. Back at the station, Rowan began digging harder into Derek Ames. His record was thin, but something didn't sit right. In 2009, he'd worked as a wilderness guide in Arizona. His employment had ended abruptly, with no clear reason in the files. A brief civil complaint had been filed against him by a female hiker, alleging harassment on a backcountry trip. It never went to court. She found something else, too. In May 2011, 3 days before Evan Hart vanished, Ames had been ticketed for parking violations near a river access point less than 5 miles from Horseshoe Bend. He had never mentioned it. It wasn't in his tip call, and yet it placed him in the area at the exact time Evan was last seen. Rowan filed for a warrant. It was granted within 48 hours. They returned to the trailer with backup. Wilkes, Ames, wasn't there, but his truck was parked behind the unit. Deputies entered with gloves and cameras, methodically cataloging the space. Most of it was uneventful, until they opened the locked cabinet beneath the bed. Inside was a steel box, sealed, scratched, cold to the touch. Rowan popped the latches. Inside, a pair of water-damaged trail boots, Evan's size. A rusted belt loop clip snapped off. A map with route markings in red, routes Evan had taken. And tucked beneath them all, a photograph. It was creased and slightly torn, but unmistakable. Evan Hart, sitting by a campfire, his head turned slightly, expression wary. The background, brush and rock, matched the area near the cove he was headed for. He hadn't taken the photo. Someone else had. Rowan called the lab, then the Harts. Daniel took the news with quiet fury. Joan was silent for nearly an hour. "So he was followed," she finally said. "He wasn't paranoid." Rowan issued a warrant for Thomas Wilkes's arrest on suspicion of involvement in the disappearance and possible death of Evan Hart. But Wilkes was gone. His truck was still there, his tools, even his wallet, but the man himself had vanished. A bolo was issued across 3 states. Cameras checked, trails watched. No sign. But Rowan believed he wouldn't go far. People like that didn't run. They hid, and the river hid things better than anyone. A week later, a ranger near Navajo Bridge found a makeshift camp beneath the span. Recently used, still warm. Among the ashes was a photograph. Burned. The same one they had found under the bed. But this time, Evan's face had been scratched out. Rowan stared at it for a long time. 12 years, a trail gone cold. And now, the person who might hold the answers had slipped through her fingers. But she had something she hadn't before. Motive, evidence, footage. And now, she had to ask, what exactly did Evan record before he died? The camcorder that had been retrieved from the waterproof bag beneath the river wasn't done revealing its secrets. After the initial video was extracted, Evan's grim message about being followed, lab technicians continued working on the damaged drive. It took nearly 2 weeks of meticulous restoration before they were able to recover more footage. Detective Rowan watched the recovered files alone in a dimly lit evidence room, flanked by 2 crime lab analysts. The videos had no sound, just corrupted audio static, but the images spoke clearly enough. The first new clip showed Evan cooking over a campfire, the flames licking upward as he stirred something in a metal pot. He looked tired. He kept glancing over his shoulder. At one point, he stood up, walked toward the camera, and adjusted it slightly. There was a timestamp in the corner. May 10th, 2011. 6:47 p.m. Just 2 days after his last verified sighting. In the next clip, night had fallen. The camera sat low on a rock, angled at Evan's tent. He was inside, but movement in the shadows caught Rowan's attention. There, at the edge of the frame, was a figure. Barely visible, barely moving. Watching. The form stood for at least a minute, motionless, before stepping away. Rowan felt her chest tighten. She scrubbed through to the final clip, an abrupt recording that began in pitch blackness, lit only by Evan's headlamp. The footage shook wildly. Evan was breathing heavily, the lens jerking as he turned the camera toward the dark around him. He whispered something into the lens, but the audio remained irretrievable. Then the camera panned to the ground. Bootprints, not his, heavy, uneven, pointed toward his tent. Then, just before the camera cut out, a flash of another person. A face partially turned, just enough to catch the outline of a scar beneath one eye. Rowan froze the image. She pulled up Thomas Wilkes, a.k.a. Derek Ames, booking photo from his brief detainment back in 2008 during the civil harassment complaint. There it was, a crescent-shaped scar just beneath his left eye, partially obscured by facial hair in later years. That was enough. A warrant was issued for Wilkes's arrest on charges of murder, concealment of evidence, and obstruction. Federal agencies joined the manhunt. His truck was processed. DNA samples were sent for comparison against trace evidence pulled from the sealed waterproof bag. Partial matches were found on the belt loop clip and inside one of the trail boots. The case was coming together, but still, he was gone. Wilkes had fled without money, without transport, and without any clear direction. But Rowan suspected he hadn't gone far. She returned to his campsite under the bridge, searching the ashes, the undergrowth, the surrounding cliffs. The spot offered a clear view of the water, a view Evan himself might have chosen. It wasn't random. Beneath a flat rock by the edge of the campfire ring, she found something Wilkes had missed. A torn page from a notebook, half burned, a scrap of Evan's journal. It read, "I saw him again today. Same hat, Same limp. He knows I know. And at the bottom, one final line. If I don't make it out, he's the reason. Rowan took the evidence to the Harts personally. Joan held the page like it was a piece of her son's soul. Daniel sat with his hands pressed to his face for a long time. Neither of them spoke for nearly an hour. When they did, it was Joan who finally broke the silence. I always said it. I always said he didn't just fall, that someone was out there. You were right, Rowan said. And now we have enough. But we need to find him. Later that week, Rowan returned to the river with a different team. 2 rangers, 1 tactical specialist, and a trained tracking dog brought in from Utah. They combed through the scrublands and hidden cliff paths Wilkes might have used to hide or escape. On the 4th day, they found something else. A makeshift shelter, deeper inland, covered with tarps and branches. It had been used recently. Inside, among food wrappers and a moldy blanket, they found a journal. Not Evan's, Wilkes. He hadn't written much. Just scattered phrases and erratic sketches. But one entry chilled Rowan to the bone. He kept looking at me like I didn't belong. He thought he was better. Out there with his camera, his smile, like he owned the silence. I showed him it wasn't his. Another entry read, "Tried to let the river keep him, but he still came back." The final page was empty, except for one line. I see him in the water now. Rowan left the shelter and looked down toward the river winding far below. The current seemed to whisper through the canyon walls. She wondered if guilt had finally caught up with Wilkes. If perhaps, after 12 years of hiding, the man had found the only escape he trusted. But there was no body, no trace of where he'd gone next. And the river once again said nothing. The media frenzy that followed the manhunt for Thomas Wilkes, formerly Derek Ames, was swift and insatiable. News outlets revisited every grim detail of Evan Hart's disappearance, the bizarre twist with the catfish, and the discovery of the hidden camera footage. Experts weighed in on wilderness crime, forensic recovery from rivers, and the psychology of fugitive behavior. Commentators speculated whether Wilkes had fled into Mexico, taken his own life, or was simply waiting to be caught in some forgotten corner of the desert. But as June gave way to July, the trail ran cold. Wilkes was, once again, a ghost. For Detective Rowan, this was a deeply personal frustration. Every piece of evidence painted a picture of guilt. His proximity to the disappearance, the physical evidence hidden in his trailer, the footage of a scarred man lurking outside Evan's tent, the journal with its confessions, mad, cryptic, and unrepentant. But there was one thing that continued to haunt her. The second camera, not Evan's, but Wilkes's. The photo found in the steel box under Wilkes's bed hadn't been taken by accident. It was composed, framed, too still to have been a candid. Someone had followed Evan long enough to observe his routines, find the right moment, and click the shutter without being noticed. That kind of predation required patience, intent. Rowan had forensic analysts re-examine every inch of the photo. Digital enhancements revealed what no one had initially noticed. A faint figure in the distance, barely visible. Evan turning toward the camera, which meant he had seen the photographer. Maybe not clearly, maybe not until it was too late, but he knew someone was there. The team expanded the search beyond Wilkes's hideout. They began canvassing pawn shops, antique dealers, second-hand stores in Flagstaff, Page, and Kayenta, hoping that Wilkes may have dumped or sold the camera at some point. It wasn't likely, but it was possible. A week later, a pawn shop clerk in Tuba City called in a tip. A man matching Wilkes's description had visited the shop 6 months earlier, trying to sell a bag of outdoor gear. Among the items? An old Sony digital camera with a cracked viewfinder. He left when the clerk offered too little. The shop had surveillance footage. The timestamp aligned. The man was Wilkes. The gear bag was navy blue, identical to the model listed in Evan's original missing gear inventory. The camera? Possibly Evan's second device, the one he used for scenic photos, separate from his camcorder. That clue led to something unexpected. A woman. The clerk recalled Wilkes leaving with the camera, but handing the bag off to a woman who entered the store after him. He called her Cass, the clerk said. She had long gray hair and walked with a cane. Detectives tracked Cass down in Chinle, Arizona. Her full name, Cassidy Bell, age 64. A transient who had lived in and around tribal lands for decades, known for taking in strays, people, and things. When they found her, she was in a van parked outside a food pantry, feeding 2 cats from a bag of kibble. When questioned, Cassidy didn't deny knowing Wilkes. "He came to me a couple times," she said. "Said he needed a place to sleep. Told me he'd done something bad." "What kind of bad?" Rowan asked. Cassidy lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. "Didn't say. Just said a boy went missing, and he saw it happen." Rowan's heart jumped. "He said he saw it?" His words, not mine, kept saying the river took the boy, but he let it happen. "Did he give you anything?" Cassidy nodded and reached into a plastic bin inside the van. She pulled out a cracked Sony digital camera, wrapped in an old dish towel. Rowan opened the memory slot. A 32 GB card was still inside. Back at the lab, the contents of the card were transferred to evidence drives. There were nearly 200 photos. Most were blurry, mundane, desert rocks, plants, odd angles of Wilkes's boots and hands. But the final dozen were different. They were of Evan, sitting on a rock, crossing a creek, setting up his tent, drinking from his thermos. Each image had been taken from a distance. Evan never once looked directly at the camera. It was as if someone had shadowed him silently for days, waiting for the right moment. The final image chilled Rowan to her core. It was taken at night. The campfire had burned low. Evan was inside the tent. The camera had been zoomed in through the trees. The image captured a blade, just the edge of it, gleaming in the firelight, held by an outstretched arm. The photographer was standing close, too close. It was the last photo on the card. Rowan printed it, taped it to her office wall. This was the moment it turned from watching to hunting. But there was still no body. The waterproof bag had held a boot and some clothing. The camera had given them his voice and fear. But there was no definitive confirmation of what happened to Evan Hart. Until that surfaced, the Harts could not bury their son. Rowan returned to the river. She stood alone on a rocky overlook near Horseshoe Bend, the same place Evan was last seen. The Colorado surged below her, winding endlessly through its deep sandstone canyons. She stared down into the muddy, silt-rich waters and thought about what the river had kept hidden for 12 years. She couldn't shake the words from Evan's journal. The river doesn't take, it keeps. Now it was time to ask, what else had it kept? The summer heat settled heavily over the canyons by mid-July, dragging humidity from monsoon storms into the already dense air. The river was lower now, just enough to expose certain shelves and hollows previously submerged for months at a time. It was during this critical window that Detective Rowan made a call to Dr. Maya Trenholm, the hydrologist who had helped with the earlier search. "I need you back at the river," Rowan said. "There's still something down there." Trenholm returned with a small team, this time equipped with advanced sub-bottom profiling sonar and an ROV, remotely operated vehicle, designed for deep silt environments. She directed her focus toward a part of the river known to locals as the Scoop, a deep undercut shelf that ran beneath a sharp bend where the current curled around itself. It was notoriously difficult to navigate and had never been searched thoroughly. The theory was simple. If Evan's body had entered the water and been pulled beneath, this was the likeliest place it might have been trapped. Over 2 days, the sonar team mapped a subterranean shelf nearly 30 feet long, covered in layers of accumulated silt. The ROV detected metallic anomalies and irregularities in sediment buildup. Then, on the 3rd pass, it caught something unexpected. A skeletal structure. Human. The drone's camera captured the partial remains of a human rib cage and spine, half buried in river debris. The body had become part of the landscape, draped in remnants of fabric long since faded and eroded. Beside it, buried further in the muck, was something else. An aluminum water bottle with faded stickers. One of them read, Pacific Crest Trail 2009. Evans. Recovery took hours. The currents resisted every movement. But the divers retrieved the remains, bones, fabric, the bottle, a cracked GPS unit, and brought them back to the surface. When Rowan called the Harts, she didn't speak right away. Joan's voice came through the receiver, fragile. Is it him? Yes, Rowan said softly. We found him. The Harts arrived the following morning. They declined to view the remains directly. Instead, they sat in a quiet room with Rowan, as a forensic specialist, explained what they had recovered. No cause of death could be determined from the bones alone, though several ribs showed stress fractures consistent with a fall or a blow. But the biggest clue came from the GPS unit. It was badly damaged, but its internal storage was intact. Forensics retrieved a single breadcrumb trail logged during Evan's last hike. It showed his route from the overlook to his final camp. And then a sudden diversion. One that led him up a narrow ravine, away from his marked trail, then down again in a looping path that ended at the water's edge, just above the scoop. There were no return tracks. Rowan traced the path on a digital map, noting its odd pattern. It almost looked like he was running. The trail doubled back once, moved erratically. He was being chased, she said aloud to no one. More confirmation came from soil samples taken from Wilkes's shelter beneath Navajo Bridge. Microscopic analysis showed trace deposits of a rare diatom, a type of algae, only found in 2 known locations along that stretch of the Colorado. One was the scoop. He'd been there. Wilkes, or someone working with him, had brought Evan to that spot, or followed him there, and watched him die. The timeline slowly came into focus. Wilkes must have followed Evan for days, as evidenced by the photos. He waited, watched. Then something shifted. Perhaps Evan confronted him. Perhaps Wilkes made his move. Whatever happened, Evan fled. He took the GPS. He ran. And he never made it out of the river. Back in Flagstaff, the Harts prepared for a private memorial. They chose not to hold a public service. Too many questions still lingered. Too much pain had been drawn out over too many years. Rowan attended anyway, sitting quietly at the back of the chapel, not in uniform. Afterward, Daniel Hart approached her in the parking lot. You didn't stop, he said, even when everyone else did. I owed you that, she said. You owe us nothing, he replied. He was just a boy who loved being alone out there. And someone took that from him. Rowan nodded. We'll find him. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. Wilkes had vanished. No new sightings. No financial trail. No stolen vehicles. Nothing. She went back to the river again that evening, driving alone, standing at the same overlook Evan had once visited. She turned on her recorder and dictated a memo. Subject: Evan Hart. Disappearance resolved. Remains located. Confirmed deceased. Likely victim of homicide, suspect at large. Evidence indicates predatory stalking behavior with possible escalation intent. She paused. Note: suspect shows pattern of disappearance following high-pressure pursuit. Believed to have wilderness survival skills. Do not rule out self-inflicted death, but continue tracking efforts until confirmed. She stopped the recording, and then she sat down on a flat rock near the edge, watching the river crawl beneath the canyon shadows. The wind whispered around her, the same way it had when Evan walked those trails, the same way it had when he looked over his shoulder and knew someone was there. The Colorado didn't just take, it kept, and sometimes it gave back, but not everything. Not yet. Detective Rowan wasn't done, not even close. Evan's remains had been recovered. Evidence of stalking, of a chase, and likely murder had been verified. But justice, the kind that held someone accountable and looked a grieving family in the eye, remained out of reach. And that gnawed at her more than anything. Back at the department, she compiled everything into a fresh case file, over 400 pages thick. She included digital stills from the camcorder footage, the GPS trail overlay, forensic reports from the clothing, and new information from the thermal signatures recorded by drone near Wilkes' abandoned shelters. The pieces were there. She just hadn't yet assembled them into something that pointed to where Wilkes had gone. Until she noticed a pattern. While reviewing old call records and tip logs, Rowan flagged one curious detail. In the summer of 2014, 3 years after Evan's disappearance, a park ranger at Navajo National Monument logged a brief but strange encounter with a man camping without a permit. The man had given a false name, no ID, and claimed to be just passing through. The ranger let him off with a warning, but jotted down details in the incident ledger. Thin, beard, southern accent, limp on left side. Said he lived off the grid. Rowan checked the ranger's archived body cam. There was no footage of the encounter. It had occurred during a technical failure with a new recording system. But the ranger, who was still employed, clearly remembered the man. "Yeah," he said when she showed him Wilkes's photo. "That's him. He had this weird calm, like he knew the land better than I did." Rowan mapped the location. Navajo National Monument wasn't far from the confluence of the Colorado and Little Colorado rivers. The terrain was rugged but dotted with dozens of old mining shafts, caves, and historic ruins. It was the kind of place a survivalist could disappear into, especially if he knew how to avoid detection. She requested aerial LiDAR sweeps of the area, a method of penetrating dense vegetation and topography to locate man-made structures or anomalies. It took a week to secure the funding and equipment, but when the data finally came back, one image stood out. A sinkhole nearly 18 feet wide, partially collapsed near an old uranium mine, with signs of crude roofing material visible inside the cavity. It was less than 40 miles from where Wilkes had last been seen. A team of tactical officers, forensic specialists, and 2 Navajo Nation officers assembled before dawn. They approached the sinkhole on foot, wary of setting off any traps. Wilkes had once worked in mining and would know how to fortify a hiding place. The roof had partially caved in during a spring storm 2 years ago, and the remaining structure looked unstable. Still, they proceeded. Inside, they found signs of life: a cot, canned food, a journal, 2 knives, a satellite radio, destroyed beyond repair, and a wall of photographs, most faded, some torn, all pinned meticulously with pieces of bone. At the center, Evan Hart's face. Repeated. Copied from missing person posters, printed digitally from archived news sites, even sketched by hand. All staring back at them. Rowan felt ice in her spine. The journal was worse. Scattered notes, dates, phrases, most incoherent rambling. But some stood out. "He took the trails from me. He walked them like they were his. I tried to warn him. He wouldn't listen. When they come for me, I'll be gone like he was. I am the silence they never hear until it's too late." And then the last entry, dated roughly 6 months prior. "The river told me to stay, but now it's restless. I see him in the current. His eyes don't blink anymore." There was no sign of Wilkes himself, no tracks leading in or out since the last rains. He'd either abandoned the shelter weeks ago or he'd never made it out. That evening, a forensic dog signaled near the collapsed portion of the sinkhole, just beneath a slab of broken concrete. Excavation crews were called in. Hours later, they uncovered what remained of a body, bones crushed by falling rock, decomposed to the point of anonymity. No ID, no DNA match yet. But on the left femur, a healed fracture, exactly where Wilkes's medical records indicated he'd suffered a compound break in 2002. The jawbone revealed a metal pin. Dental records were obtained. 3 days later, confirmation came in. Thomas Wilkes was dead, crushed beneath the place he'd turned into a shrine, or prison, or tomb. Rowan returned to the Harts one final time. She didn't bring files or evidence or statements, just a quiet truth. "He's gone," she said. "We found him." Joan didn't cry this time. She simply sat at the kitchen table and nodded slowly, staring down at her hands. Daniel exhaled deeply. "That's it then." Rowan shook her head. "That's not justice, but it's an ending." They buried Evan Hart 2 weeks later in a small cemetery outside Flagstaff. His gravestone read, Evan Miles Hart, 1983-2011. He walked the silent trails with wonder and never walked alone. Rowan attended, not as a detective, but as someone who had walked beside him, after the fact, through every trail, every shadow, every unanswered question. And now, at last, the questions had stopped. But the river still whispered. 6 months later, the river ran low again, its mood subdued beneath a crisp, gray winter sky. Snow clung to the canyon rims. The Colorado River moved slow and cold, weaving silently past the same bend where Evan Hart had been last seen. Time had begun to settle over the tragedy, softening its sharper edges in the public mind. But for Detective Rowan, and for the Harts, it remained unfinished in its own way. Rowan found herself back at the Overlook, standing alone with a thermos of coffee and the last box of files from the Hart investigation. She wasn't there to reopen anything. There were no new leads. Wilkes was dead. The remains confirmed. The case, officially, was closed. And yet something still hummed at the edge of her thoughts. Justice, she had come to learn, was rarely neat. In the movies, the killer gets caught, confesses, and the story ends in catharsis. But in real life, especially with crimes tied to wilderness, solitude, and obsession, the truth has a way of fraying. Lives are not just lost, they're unraveled. Evan Hart hadn't been killed because of a feud or money or revenge. He'd been taken because someone else saw in him something they couldn't understand, or perhaps something they envied. His peace, his self-reliance, his silence. Wilkes Ames hadn't just stalked him. He'd studied him, wanted to possess the freedom Evan embodied, and when he couldn't, he destroyed it. But Rowan also knew this. Evan had fought back. He left clues, footage, evidence. Even from the grave, he'd refused to disappear entirely, and without that camera, without that GPS trail, Wilkes might never have been discovered. In his quiet way, Evan had helped solve his own case. Rowan sat down on the same rock where she'd recorded her case notes months earlier. She pulled out her phone, hit record, and began. Final memo. Subject: Evan Miles Hart. All evidence confirmed. Remains recovered. Primary suspect: Thomas Wilkes, deceased. Cause of death: structural collapse in remote hideout. Case closed, pending archival. She hesitated, then added, recommend cross-referencing Wilkes's wilderness patterns with other unsolved disappearances in Four Corners region. Unconfirmed possibility of serial stalking behavior dating back to 2007. Suggest follow-up analysis by Behavioral Crimes Unit. She ended the recording. Let the silence settle. Behind her, wind moved over the cliffs, stirring dry grass and loose stone. Somewhere below, the river moved on, slow, steady, uncaring. Rowan didn't expect answers from it anymore, but she respected what it had given back. Weeks later, she boxed the last of the evidence, sealed it, and filed the Hart case into permanent record. One of hundreds. but it wouldn't be forgotten. At the Harts' home, Joan had begun painting again, something she hadn't done since Evan's disappearance. Small watercolor landscapes, rivers, canyons, ghostly trails. When she mailed one to Rowan, there was no note, just a signature in the corner and a compass faintly drawn in the clouds. Daniel started volunteering with search and rescue teams, quietly, without fanfare. Just a man who understood what it was to lose someone to the wild and what it meant to keep looking anyway. And the last mystery, the one that started it all, remained almost poetic. The catfish. No one could say how or why Evan's keychain ended up inside that fish 12 years after he vanished. Whether it had sat on the riverbed all that time, swallowed by chance, or whether the river somehow had chosen to return it. Whatever the case, it was a final gesture, a breadcrumb, a whisper in the deep. And it was enough.